the title of my talk is a little bit confusing, be patient with me. I hope that towards the end, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. You see, my journey as a research student started in a corridor way before I started my DPhil. I was teaching as a part-time instructor a basic liberal arts course that all students have to take at a local university in Beirut, Lebanon, called Cultural Studies. And in it, we were reading texts, specifically 19th and 20th century seminal texts by, of course, the variety of authors such as Freud, Marx, Hegel, Nietzsche, and many others. And I noticed that the best conversations used to take place in the corridor outside of the classroom after the class was over. Like, of course, inside the class, I'd like to believe that the conversations were quite compelling and exciting. But when we stepped out into the corridor after every session, a band of students and myself would engage in very, very interesting conversations. And so one day, one of my students said, hey, why don't we take this further after the course? Why don't we take that corridor elsewhere and continue our conversations? And indeed, we started something called Kharij an al-Saf, which is Arabic for outside of the classroom, but also meaning out of line. And we started to meet in different spaces around the city, such as cafes and other spaces, to take our conversation further and our learning further. And we started to invite speakers and explore and experiment with ideas, sometimes through practice, more specifically praxis. So we take theory and try to apply it, and then through a dialectical process, try to understand what we're observing, what we're experiencing, and what we're learning about the world, and more specifically the social world that we're engaging with. And one of the speakers we once invited to talk to us about his research journey was the late Samah Hadris, one of the founders of a very important literary journal in Beirut called Al-Adab. And I remember when he talked to us, he was telling us, he was sharing his experience as a researcher, as a research student at Columbia, working alongside the late, of course, famous Edward Said. And I remember Samah mentioned something that stayed with me and impacted me a lot. He said the first year he was a research student was the best learning experience of his entire life. Specifically because when we start our research journey, we are completely lost. We don't know exactly what we're looking for. We don't know exactly the path that we're choosing for our research. And so we are open to learning, to experimenting, to dabbling with and grappling with different ideas, theoretical frameworks, methodologies. And so he stressed that year and what he had learned during that year was the knowledge that stayed with him throughout of his career. And he had never had another opportunity where he could learn in such a lateral way so many things at once. And so I love this idea. And lo and behold, when the year after I went to the UK to start my doctoral research, I decided I want exactly that. And so what I did is I started to dip in everything I could get my hands on. And so during the first year, I was reading theory, dipping into and grappling with ideas left, right, and center, exploring different methodologies, at the expense of even having a semblance of a research topic or a research question. And so every time my cohort and I would get together with our supervisors and other professors to discuss, our progress and whether we've come up with a research question or a research focus, I would always start my presentation, my 5-minute presentation with, currently I am grappling with, and then I would ramble on for a few minutes trying to come up with what seems to be like an acceptable research topic. But I'd be all over the place because I was so excited about what I was learning, what I was reading, and the wealth of knowledge that I was gaining, and the wealth of perspectives that I was also building. And so after a few times of me trying to grapple with ideas in public in front of my cohort of professors, my supervisor and friends started to call me the grappler because I would use that term so much. And so that became my nickname for a few years at the education department there. And so, but I was so excited about this experience, and I didn't want it to end. After my first year, I came up with a focused research topic and successfully, defended it. And I had to embark on my fieldwork. And my topic was about education in Lebanon. And so I traveled back to Lebanon to do fieldwork for a year. And during that year, my appetite for grappling with ideas beyond what my research focus is continued. I couldn't quench it or quell it. And so after a few months of radio silence with my supervisor, I received a very dreadful email. That email that we all dread to receive from our supervisors. And this is what it said. I know you've got to do everything at once. It is just that I also know you could finish your dissertation soon if you put your mind to it. No more grappling. The third space has to be the space after submission. Now, this is not my supervisor in the image above. I just thought I'd put an image of a professor that looks a little bit foreboding and threatening, just to dramatize things a little bit. Now, I know the email might seem a little bit confusing and cryptic, but it made total sense to me. I know that the no more grappling part probably makes sense to you now, but the other part that says the third space has to be the space after submission comes from a different story. During that year, when I went back to Beirut to do my field work, I was invited to speak at the local TEDx Beirut conference that was taking place that year. And I decided to call my presentation Inviting a Third. In it, I wanted to critique TED Talks because they usually present us with a polished nugget of wisdom while hiding or concealing the messy, agonizing part that goes into preparing that presentation. And this is why I decided to stand on the periphery of that red circle in the middle of which we're supposed to stand, because I wanted to share with the audience the process and the journey that went into preparing my presentation, thinking about the things I had to think about, the messy process of knowledge building and construction that goes into preparing a presentation or sharing the outcome of a certain learning journey. And so instead of delivering to the audience a very polished presentation about the outcome of my thinking process, I decided to step aside and stand in that in-between space, the space between polished knowledge as we usually deliver it to a certain audience and the messy process that goes into constructing that knowledge. And in that liminal zone, in that little corridor between the backstage and the spotlight, I told my story. the story about my thinking process, and invited the audience to step into that third space, that in-between space, and think about the issues I wanted to unpack and foreground. And here I'd like to invite everybody watching to think about the concept of findings, because that concept we dabble with a lot when we're doing research. In fact, we dedicate a whole section of our dissertation usually to findings, as though we had found a treasure that comes in a beautiful, polished form, and we're just presenting it as is to our audience. But in reality, the process is much messier than we'd like to show. But we all know it deep inside, and we all share that. And instead of just presenting the gems, the treasures, in a conventional way to a particular audience, how much more meaning and wealth and depth can we provide if we tell stories instead? Because there's something very unique about stories. We as a species have been learning about the world through stories for thousands of years. And we love to listen to stories, and stories bring out the complexity and messiness of the world in an elegant, creative, and structured way. To best explain what I mean by that, I'm going to tell you a quick story. And this story I read to my students every time I teach research methods in education, because I believe that it expresses a fundamental truth about social science research. And I'm sure many of you have read this. It's called How to Catch a Star by Oliver Jeffers. Now, I truncated the story to make it short, but in a nutshell, there's a boy, he loves stars, and he wanted a star of his very own. And so he woke up one morning and decided to go and catch a star. He tried different things. He tried to jump up and reach the star and catch it. He climbed a tree. He tried to lasso it. Nothing worked. And then at sunset, he saw the star getting closer to the horizon. So he ran up the jetty and tried to catch it. It was still out of reach. He then saw the reflection of the star in the water and thought, now I can catch it. But that didn't work either. And then he thought, well, maybe the star will wash up to the beach. And so he went and waited, and finally he found the star washed up on the shore. And so the boy had caught a star of his very own. Now, of course, the question, did the boy catch the star? There are so many different stars in this story, different stars that the boy was observing, contemplating, reaching out to, and then catching. Now, of course, we can argue that all of the stars in the story are stars, are different kinds of stars. But it is the story that was told that created this connection between all of these stars and gave meaning to this journey that the boy underwent. And so the power of storytelling gripped my imagination and influenced everything I did as a doctoral student and later on as a professional. And after finally completing my doctoral dissertation, and this is a picture of me taken right after my viva, I decided to go back to Lebanon and explore ways in which I can open up these third spaces, these liminal zones, these corridors where meaning and storytelling can help me and people I'm working with explore the social world in a deep, meaningful way in order to transform it. And so a few years later, I co-founded a company called La'ab, which is Arabic for play. Our motto is Play Seriously Works, in which we use different play forms to help organizations and teams reflect on their social realities, on their organizations, on their group dynamics and interactions, on their work culture, in order to understand it more deeply and to transform it together. And one of the most important play forms we usually use is narrative play. We draw on such models as Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey to help teams tell their stories together, understand their work and their interactions in organizations more deeply and meaningfully, and to come up with alternative narratives and stories. We also use Lego Serious Play as well as other play forms to help them construct these stories, including the characters, the plots, the narratives in them, in order to better understand their shared realities and their work together, and to work alongside each other in order to transform and develop their work by co-constructing alternative stories and scenarios. And although we do resort to conventional methods to understand what these teams are experiencing at work, such as the use of questionnaires, which we are currently gamifying, by the way, but still, we also understand the water cooler phenomenon at any organization, which is the place where people usually meet outside of their conventional settings and talk about things that they normally don't talk about inside meetings. And so in that water cooler space, that third space, that little corridor, a lot of stories are constructed about people's work realities. And what we try to do through storytelling and play is help teams step into those corridors in order to explore their experience in a richer way. Now, let me try to bring it all together and connect it to the title, which is the Corridorical Imperative in Educational Research. I think it's imperative upon us as researchers to invite our audience into these corridors where the stories that we are trying to tell can come to life and can communicate a deeper sense of meaning about the social realities we are trying to understand and eventually transform. And I imagine that when you finish your studies, you're going to be considered an expert in your field. But with expertise sometimes comes with a sort of tunnel vision, because we become so focused on a specific field or area or a niche, which is a good thing. But I also invite you to also maintain a corridor perspective, a corridor vision onto the world that may open a space to engage with the world in a more complex, dynamic, even playful way in order to better understand it and transform it together.